I want to talk about the Civil War because when I hear people today saying that we're the most politically divided we've ever been and it's dire, I kind of I definitely don't buy into that because in my mind I'm thinking, at some point in our history we literally fought a civil war because we were so divided. And obviously we're not fighting a civil war today, so I'm sure it can't be as bad as it was then. Can you trace the causes of the Civil War to these two differing Enlightenment views?
Yes, I think it definitely is related, but not maybe in a way that that is so obvious. Let me try to explain. I mean, the great contradiction of the American founding was in our credo, the Declaration of Independence. There is the foundational presumption is that all are created equal. And I've made the point, as have other Jeffersonians, that he wasn't actually only talking about white men. I mean, it was really all humanity. And of course, the contradiction was we were a society that, at least in parts, embraced slavery, and going back, many parts of the country did. I think most of our founders recognized that the contradiction, and that slavery was not an institution that could survive were we to promulgate the meaning of the Declaration. But for political reasons and for compromise, they avoided it in the constitutional blueprint. And some would say, "What a horrible thing." Others might say, "If we hadn't done that, we never would have created a country." So I view the compromises that were made in forming the Constitution as fundamental to a process by which you move forward. Because had we not gotten there, we wouldn't have had a country. Now, I think what exploded in the Civil War was the realization of this contradiction in our values, but at the same time, the economic pressures and in a good part of our country that where the economy was entirely dependent on the institution, and where the North was increasingly gaining power through its industrial might. And so the reason why how it applies to the two views of the Enlightenment was the Jeffersonian decentralized view would probably argue that the South had the right to secede, that based on their f- belief that the founding premises. And I could argue that that's a flawed analysis, because the founding premises talked about equality, but still the notion of the Constitution following in the wake of the Declaration was that when a government is not meeting the needs of its people, and the people can present grievances and document them, which of course was the model of the Declaration, then they have the right to form their own government. So one could make the argument, I think, and I think some have, that the democratic that the radical Enlightenment view might have supported the secession of the southern states. I think what the brilliance of Lincoln was, he interpreted, first of all, he thought that in some ways the Constitution was was subordinate to the Declaration. That, in other words, the Declaration was the credo, the mission, if you will, and the Constitution was its blueprint, how to get there. But as he famously said, we have work to do. We're not, we have to amend the Constitution as our founders wanted to continue to better our society. So he viewed the mission of establishing the America as an ongoing work that started with the Declaration, but was still happening. And the idea of abolishing slavery, I think, was a part of an arc, which according to progressives, they would call it the arc of progress, right? Over time. But there's no question that your point is valid. Is that in terms of division, I don't think we were ever more divided. In fact, one of the things that I write often about is it's not so much whether we're divided or not; it's how we deal with it. And in the Civil War, the way we dealt with it was, of course, quite horribly, with quite a lot of violence. One of the reasons I promote so often the idea of more productive dialogue between the left and the right, or between the red and blue America, whatever you want to call it, is that I think we have to recognize that we're not the enemy. We have to talk to each other, and try not to get to a point where it's violent, where that's the goal, is to avoid that. And one of the failures in my mind of political leaders in the last 30 years, both left and right, is this willingness to demonize their opponents as if like they're bad people. When people disagree on on issues that are fair, and you know 70 million people can't be bad. And that, have the man voted for Trump or the man voted for Biden. They're both around 75 million. I mean, so the point is that people can disagree about issues, and how can they disagree productively so that we move towards solution? I think the failure in elected politics of our time, and the failure that your generation is going to increasingly have to grapple with, is if we continue to use tactics that make us seem like enemies, as opposed to trying to find ways to bridge us and pull us together. In my mind, it may win a short-term battle, but it's a losing proposition.
100%. And that goes back to the personality over policy debate and the tribal politics that we talked about last episode. But that's such an interesting point you make about there's a case to be made that secession was actually a testament to radical Enlightenment ideals, even though it may be a flawed argument. And I did an episode with a professor named Joshua Morrow a while back, and we talked about why did the South secede, and we really fleshed that out. And one of the questions I asked was, America at its founding technically seceded from the British monarchy, and that was the Declaration of Independence. So isn't there a case to be made that the South had a right to do that if our nation did it in the first place?
Well, you have to be careful here. This is a great question. After in the early years of the country, there were two very famous rebellions where citizens tried to secede again. The first was the Shays Rebellion. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Shays Rebellion, during the Revolutionary War, many of the farmers who fought, and many gave their lives, in fact, really stood up. Shay was a farmer in Massachusetts who fought in the war. And what happened was in the 1780, late 80s, in order to resolve the debt problem, to pay for the war, Hamilton, of course, his plan involved a financial solution which created a lot of debt. And the ones holding the debt and getting hurt were often common citizens like Shay and his fellow farmers, because their prices went way up. I mean, economically, it worked against their favor, and they were outraged. Now, so they basically said, we have grievances, like did our forebears in 1776, and we are going to rebel against the government of Massachusetts in this case. And it happened again later with the Whiskey Rebellion for taxes on whiskey. Now, at the time, George Washington, our president, was very specific about delineating that in the earlier cases, 1776, that the grievances so documented were so extensive and so beyond the notion of any resolution, because the colonists had no voice, that's what justified a revolution. Whereas in the latter two cases, Shay and his counterparts, as well as in the Whiskey Rebellion, these were citizens who had a voice, right? They may have been outvoted, but they were in the process. So Washington, I think, would have said, in order to justify, and this is so fascinating because of course we could talk about January 6th, right? Was that a fair rebellion, or was it? I think I looked at this from many sides. I think Washington, in his argument, and the Federalists of the time would have said that both the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion needed to be put down, as I would think they would say about January 6th, because these are people who are involved in the process, and they're, as much as some of our politicians want to say things are stolen and it's corrupt, that there's no documented evidence that's the case. So the point being is that we do have a democratic process that we have to live by, and it doesn't mean in that process that you get what you want all the time. Sometimes you lose the vote. And that doesn't, losing the vote or getting outvoted does not justify armed rebellion.
That's a fascinating discussion to be had. Do these people have a right to rebel, or are they wrong? Because like you said, these are people who are actually contributing in the democratic process.
Well, they have a right to rebel. So let me be clear. They absolutely have a right to protest. And if they don't like the outcome of legislation, they can present ideas, they can scream, they can yell. They can't kill people. I mean, this is where violence is a very protest is a wonderful tradition in our country. I mean, and it's been part of so many movements. So the notion of making your voice heard outside of just the voting booth through organization, through assembly, through protesting, all of that is very much sanctioned by the American process and tradition. I think it's when is armed rebellion justified, and I think the circumstances are very narrow. But in the Civil War, obviously, the South thought the circumstances applied.
Yeah, let's be quite clear. Violence is never the answer.